Good afternoon, and welcome to the Akron Roundtable. I'm Angelina Milo, Board Chair and President of the Akron Roundtable Board of Directors. Today's program will be rebroadcast on Thursday, April 22nd at 8 p.m. on WKSU 89.7 FM. We're delighted that so many of you are able to join us today for this virtual forum, as it is our privilege to welcome to the roundtable stage Dr. Jeff Reutter. His topic is Lake Erie, Understanding Its Past and Predicting Its Future. We sincerely thank the Akron Summit County Public Library for continuing to host our virtual events. We're also thankful for the generous support Akron Roundtable receives from sponsors, patrons, and subscribers. Please visit our website at akronroundtable.org if you would like to make a contribution. We truly appreciate your support. A list of our board members can also be found at our website. I must say I'm very grateful and very fortunate to serve alongside such an outstanding group of community leaders who are truly dedicated to the Akron Roundtable mission. Please mark your calendars now for our next event, which is Thursday, May 20th, when we will host Dr. Gary Miller, the president of the University of Akron. You can read more about our upcoming speakers as well as our podcasts by going to our website. Again, our website address is akronroundtable.org. Today's speaker, Dr. Jeff Reutter, will be introduced by fellow Akron Roundtable Board member Emerita Fran Buckholzer. Following his presentation, Dr. Reutter has generously agreed to take questions from the audience. Fellow Akron Roundtable Board member John Williams, Deputy Executive Director and Chief Operating Officer of Alpha Phi Alpha Homes, will coordinate that portion of the program. To facilitate your questions today, we'll be using Asker technology. Asker technology enables you to submit questions via mobile devices. Questions may be submitted at any time during our program and will be forwarded for review during our Q&A portion. Watch the screen for instructions should you need them. And now, it is my pleasure and privilege to introduce to you Fran Buckholzer. Franny?
Well, thank you all for joining us today. It's really going to be a wonderful presentation. The Great Lakes are the largest group of freshwater lakes on planet Earth, containing 21% of the world's surface freshwater by volume, with Lake Erie being the fourth largest of those lakes and the 11th largest freshwater lake globally. The economic and environmental impact on our lives of the Great Lakes, Lake Erie in particular, is immeasurable. In addition to the weather and climate we experience, Lake Erie is one of Ohio's most valuable natural resources and an essential element to Ohio's present and future economic strategies. Lake Erie provides drinking water for 3 million residents, as well as water for industrial and agricultural uses, shipping, commercial and sport fishing, transportation, and tourism. Visitors to Ohio's Lake Erie region spend more than $10.7 billion annually, nearly 30% of Ohio's total tourism dollars. That's fantastic. For example, Lake Erie's recreational boating industry supports more than 26,000 jobs with an economic impact of $3.5 billion plus annually, while exceptional hunting and fishing opportunities attract an estimated 1.5 million hunters and anglers who each year spend over $2 billion a year annually. The point of all this being, cleaning up Lake Erie and supporting public policies that promote a healthy and sustainable lake ecosystem is vital to the economy, the environment, and the quality of life of all Ohioans, and a very important responsibility all of us have to protect this irreplaceable natural resource. Happily, there are government, educational, private, nonprofit institutions and dedicated individuals, like our speaker today, Dr. Jeff Reutter, that are committed to promoting and implementing such policies, and we all need to support them. In fact, Dr. Reutter devoted his 45-year career to working on Lake Erie issues and promoting policies that would sustain and preserve this invaluable resource, from combating algae blooms, reducing chemicals and phosphorus pollution, to controlling invasive species, monitoring climate change, restoring degraded wetlands, and conserving important fish habitats. Before his well-deserved retirement in 2015, among many other activities, Dr. Reutter directed 4 programs at Ohio State University: Stone Laboratory, Ohio Sea Grant College Program, Center for Lake Erie Area Research, CLEAR, and the Great Lakes Aquatic Ecosystem Research Consortium, a group of top scientists from 12 Ohio colleges. In addition, he's been a member of the Ocean Research and Resource Advisory Panel, serving many federal agencies and offices. From 2018 to 2021, he served as board chairman of the Ohio chapter of the Nature Conservancy, and not surprising, under his leadership, TNC had a special focus on H2 Ohio and Lake Erie issues. Dr. Reutter received his BS and MS from Ohio State University in Fisheries Management and his PhD from Ohio State in Environmental Biology. The plain dealer calls Dr. Reutter the legendary, I'm going to quote, the legendary Lake Erie scientist who has been the consummate Lake Erie expert for a long list of local, state, and federal officials, as well as the media. Put a microphone or camera in Dr. Reutter's face, and you'll get a succinct explanation that even a politician can understand. So, end of quote. So with no more ado, it's my honor and privilege, I say great honor and privilege, to bring to the microphone a legend in his own time, the one and only irreplaceable expert on Lake Erie, Dr. Jeff Reutter.
Thank you very much, Fran, for the wonderful introduction. Let me add one point to the environmental impact, the value of Lake Erie. Arguably, Lake Erie is the most valuable or most important lake in the world. Angelina, thanks much for the invitation to the Akron Roundtable. A wonderful place to speak, and I appreciate this very much. What I want to do today is raise everyone's level of understanding on how this lake works, how it functions. We'll talk about its history, we'll talk about our current status, and then I want to make some predictions based on our past history and our current understanding of where we will be in the future. On this particular slide, the take-home message is 2 things. One, as you look at it, you can see Lake Erie at the bottom. This is the southernmost of the Great Lakes. And I want to point out that all of the water from Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, and Lake Huron flows into Lake Erie through the Detroit River. We consider the Detroit River not a tributary to the lake, but a connecting channel between the lakes. So all the water from those upper lakes flows into Lake Erie, flows through Lake Erie, and then out through the Niagara River, over Niagara Falls, and into Lake Ontario. Now, as we look at the lakes in cross-section, take-home messages here are that Lake Erie is by far the shallowest of the Great Lakes. The other lakes are all over 750 feet deep. Lake Superior, 1,333 feet deep. Lake Erie, maximum depth, 210 feet. Now, if it's the southernmost and the shallowest, keep in mind that that means it has to be the warmest. And as we look at just Lake Erie in cross-section, you can see 3 distinct basins. A western basin west of Sandusky, Ohio, average depth 24 feet. An eastern basin east of Erie, Pennsylvania, where the deepest point in the lake is located, right about where the B and eastern basin is there, and that would be 210 feet. And then you see the central basin between Sandusky and Erie, average depth about 60 feet there. The red line that you see distinguishes or marks the thermocline, a warm layer on top, the cold layer of the lake on the bottom. That cold layer during the summer becomes anoxic. The oxygen in that layer is consumed by bacteria who are decomposing organic matter. When all of the oxygen is gone, we refer to that cold bottom layer as the dead zone. We'll come back to that in a second. Let's talk about where our water comes from into the lake. We know from the slide that a previous slide, that a bunch is coming through the Detroit River. In fact, 80 to 90% of all the water coming into Lake Erie comes through the Detroit River. About 10% comes from direct precipitation onto the lake itself, and about 10% comes from the other small tributaries around Lake Erie, the largest of which is the Maumee River at Toledo that drains about 4 million acres of agricultural land. And that tributary is the largest to Lake Erie, but it's also the largest to any of the Great Lakes, but it brings in only about 3% of the flow into Lake Erie. So the flow from the Detroit River is about 30 times larger than the flow from the Maumee River. And the Maumee River is, again, draining about 4 million acres of agricultural land. If you look to the left on the image here, you get an idea of the difference in the watersheds of the 5 Great Lakes. And the key points here are that the watershed for Lake Erie has the most agriculture, the most or second most urban suburban land, and the least forest. Those attributes mean that Lake Erie is going to get more sediment and more nutrients than any of the other lakes. If it's the southernmost, shallowest, and warmest, then biologically it has to be the most productive if it receives the most nutrients. What I want to do, just to give you an idea of how productive it is compared to the other lakes, and again, why is Lake Erie so important? Lake Superior would be the contrast, the largest lake, the northernmost, cold and deep, not productive. Lake Erie, the southernmost, shallowest, warmest, and most productive. Lake Superior has about 50% of all the water in the Great Lakes, but only 2% of the fish. Lake Erie has 2% of the water and 50% of the fish. That's how productive this lake is. Let's stop for a second and think about the history of that fishery. It's a very challenging fishery to manage. We have 5 states and province and 2 countries to deal with. And when we talk about Lake Erie being the most productive of any of the Great Lakes, also keep in mind that 40 of the 55 years between 1915 and 1970, Lake Erie produced more fish than the other 4 Great Lakes combined. But we've got a history of overfishing. So when I look at the future of Lake Erie, people often ask me, well, is our walleye population safe? Is the yellow perch population safe? What about smallmouth bass or the steelhead that we have out there? Because of the formation of the Great Lakes Fishery Commission in 1954 and more recently the Interagency Quota Management System for walleye in 1976, and the fact that our fish managers are better trained than they've ever been before, and we have much more sophisticated analysis systems and models to manage this fishery, that I'm very convinced we are never going to overfish any species again. The likelihood of the walleye becoming extinct like the blue pike is extremely, extremely low. I am concerned, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later in the talk, about what we're doing to the habitat for these fish and the impact that aquatic invasive species can have on the fishery. And speaking of that, let's go straight to aquatic invasive species. If Lake Erie is the southernmost, the shallowest, and the warmest, and gets the most nutrients, lots and lots of food, it's also the most hospitable for aquatic invasive species. And as of 2015, we had 194 aquatic invasive species enter Lake Erie. People are very familiar with the zebra mussel and the quagga mussel there to the right, and the round goby on the lower left, incredibly abundant in Lake Erie. The thing that we're worried about right now is the invasion of silver carp, one of the 4 species of Asian carp. The silver carp is the one that people see jumping. It's not in the lake yet, but we're concerned with the impact that it would have if it got into the lake, because it's a plankton feeder, and because Lake Erie is so nutrient enriched. It has the most plankton, the most food compared to any of the other lakes. And the silver carp likes large tributaries to spawn in, and the largest tributary of the Great Lakes is the Maumee River. Lake Erie has the largest fishery, and wherever the silver carp has invaded and proliferated, the other species have gone way down. So what I expect going forward, if the silver carp would get into Lake Erie, we wouldn't see the end of the perch fishery or the walleye fishery, but I would expect those fisheries to be reduced by at least 50%. Fortunately, the rate of invasion of aquatic invasive species has gone down. So when I look at the future, the key for us is to keep out the silver carp. Now, the nutrient loading to Lake Erie that makes it so productive and gives us the walleye capital of the world with lots of fish production, it's also possible to have too much of a good thing. If we get too many nutrients flowing into Lake Erie, we get too much algae and we get the wrong kinds of algae. So in this image, you see my hand on the left in front of OSU's Stone Laboratory up at Put in Bay from 1971. And then you see the same hand on the right from 2013. We've essentially had the harmful algal blooms, the giant blooms that we had in the 1970s are back. And we need to understand how we solved this problem the first time and why it's different now and what we need to do to solve it now. Also, as we look at Lake Erie, one of the concerns, the issues that I'm often asked about is the kind of pollution that we had, the heavy metals and other materials coming in from the 1960s and the 70s. This is an image from the Cuyahoga River at about that period of time. And this is also when the river burned famously in 1969, actually the 13th time that it had burned. And the way it was covered by the media in Time magazine in an issue of Time that was the biggest seller of all time up till that point, and an issue that included the first man walking on the moon and the Ted Kennedy, Mary Jo Kopechne, Martha's Vineyard issue just was an placing the burning of the Cuyahoga River in that issue really made Lake Erie the poster child for pollution problems in this country. And I say that because of the things that occurred immediately after that burning. 1 year later, it's like as a country, we decided we've had enough. We've got to do something to address these terrible water pollution issues that we had. So a year after the burning, US EPA and NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, are formed, and we celebrate the first Earth Day, which is coming up next week, I believe. A year after that, 1971, the Canadian version of US EPA is formed, and the following year, in the spring, 1972, the U.S. and Canada signed the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. That was signed by Nixon and Trudeau, the senior Trudeau at that time. And that allowed us to bring together scientists and to identify what was causing the blooms of the algae. And we identified the problem as too much phosphorus and indicated that to address the problem from the 1970s, we needed to reduce the amount of phosphorus by 60%. In the fall of 1972, Congress passed the Clean Water Act over President Nixon's veto, and that allowed us to regulate point sources. So let's go back and think of the image that I showed earlier of the pollution coming out of the Cuyahoga River. Because of the Clean Water Act, as long as we keep the Clean Water Act strong, it's highly unlikely that we will ever see anything like that again. By regulating point sources in the 1970s, we were able to reduce the amount of phosphorus going into Lake Erie by 60%, because in those days, the phosphorus was coming from poor sewage treatment. So we improved our sewage treatment plants, phosphorus concentrate or loads went down by 60%, and the lake responded by becoming the walleye capital of the world and the best example in the world of ecosystem recovery. Let's talk a little bit about nutrient loading, the amount of nutrients that come into the lake that make it so productive and can make it too productive. And we're primarily concerned about nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. If you go into Lowe's or Home Depot and you buy a bag of fertilizer, you're going to see what we call an NPK ratio, with the amount of the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and the potassium listed on the bag. Just as the fertilizer makes your grass grow or it makes the crops grow for a farmer, if you put it into Lake Erie, it makes the algae grow. And those nutrients can come from fertilizer or they can come from manure. It doesn't make any difference to the plants. As those plants grow, the essential nutrient, and that nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, those are all essential nutrients. The plants won't grow unless they have enough of those three items. The essential nutrient that runs out first while the bloom is growing or while your grass is growing, if you use up one of those essential nutrients, we identify that nutrient as the limiting nutrient. It's the one that controls how much your grass grows or how much algae we get. In fresh water, the limiting nutrient is almost always phosphorus. In salt water, it's almost always nitrogen. Therefore, the amount of phosphorus that comes into Lake Erie determines how large our blooms, our algal blooms we get. Basically, there's three kinds of algae in Lake Erie. And in freshwater systems, this is very typical. In cold weather, we get diatoms. Those are great for the food web, great for the ecosystem. In the cool weather, we get green algae, also great for the food web and the ecosystem. But when we get high concentrations of nutrients and the weather is very warm, then we get blue-green algae, or more accurately, cyanobacteria. So too much phosphorus causes these harmful algal blooms, and it also causes the dead zone, because as that algae moves to the central basin of Lake Erie, sinks to the bottom, the decomposition of that algae by the bacteria at the bottom of the lake uses up all the oxygen and creates the dead zone. We call them harmful algal blooms because they're capable of producing toxins, and those toxins are 14% nitrogen by weight. So phosphorus would determine how big the bloom gets. Nitrogen will determine how toxic that bloom becomes. What I've done on this image is attempted to put the most toxic things at the top, the least toxic things at the bottom. The four primary algal toxins here are shown in red. Most of us think of cyanide as being pretty toxic. Note that cyanide is about 2/3 of the way down the page, indicating that the four primary algal toxins are more toxic than cyanide. Microcystin, the second one on the list here, and the first of the algal toxins, that's what caused the Toledo water crisis in 2014, where 500,000 people couldn't drink the water. The third one on the list, the second of the algal toxins, saxitoxin, that is a terrorism agent used by terrorists. Problems, some of the health problems caused by harmful algal blooms. We've seen a number of dog and livestock deaths. This is terrible for your dogs. It attacks their liver, and they really cannot deal with it. We have obviously seen the Toledo water crisis in 2014. Some other human health problems associated now with harmful algal blooms: neurological problems, rashes, breathing problems. It attacks the liver, can cause kidney problems, intestinal issues. We see an increased incidence of non-alcoholic liver cancer wherever harmful algal blooms occur. We also now are seeing early evidence to ALS, Parkinson's, and Alzheimer's disease. And we now know that the airborne impacts of these toxins can extend more than a mile inland. Also important to note, we've done a lot of work and a lot of study in Ohio on this issue in Grand Lake St. Mary's, in Lake Erie, and in other places around Ohio. But this is not just a Great Lakes or an Ohio problem. When U.S. EPA looks nationally at all the lakes and the impoundments around the country, we see that 40% of the lakes and ponds have too much phosphorus in them. Over 35% have too much nitrogen. Microcystin, that toxin, is detected in 39% of the lakes in the country, and the problem is getting worse every year. It's now in every single state. Ohio EPA has found saxitoxin, the terrorism agent, in 25% of Ohio's drinking water sources, and Lake Erie now has all four of the primary algal toxins. Now, where's this phosphorus coming from as we look at the Great Lakes system? And what I've attempted to do here, the green bars that you see, for instance, where the Detroit River comes into the Western Basin and where the Niagara River goes out, the green bars represent the connecting channels. The pink bars represent the largest loader tributaries to the Great Lakes. And the key points, there's about 4 bars that I want you to look at in particular. Notice this is from 2008. The load from the Detroit River that year was 2,000 tons of phosphorus, bringing in 90% of the water. That same year, the Maumee River at Toledo, which brings in only 3% of the water, but drains 4 million acres of agricultural land, that river brought in 3,800 tons of phosphorus. The next largest loader was the Sandusky River, draining 1.5 million acres of agricultural land and putting in 1,100 tons of phosphorus. And then you jump over to the Cuyahoga River here, putting in 452 tons. And what you rapidly see is the problem is driven by the agricultural tributaries. In the western basin of Lake Erie, even though it's only 5% of the volume of Lake Erie, gets by far more nutrients than any other location around the Great Lakes. So let's now focus on the Maumee River and get a better understanding of where the phosphorus coming from the Maumee River, where it comes from to get into the river, and what we understand now about how that load can vary from year to year. One of the key points now, if this is coming from agricultural runoff, and we know that more than 85% of that 3,800 tons that comes out of the Maumee River comes from agricultural runoff, more than 85% comes from agricultural runoff. That means that when it's not raining, there's no load going into the river because there's no runoff off the fields unless it's raining. And you would expect that when you get a very hard rain, you get more of a load. And when you get a gentle rain, you don't get too much of a load. What we found now is that about 70 to 90% of the load coming in from the Maumee River comes in during the 10 largest rain events. That brings climate change into the picture because when we look at the last 50 years, due to climate change, we have seen a 52% increase in the number of storms per year that produce more than 3 inches of rain in a 24-hour period. It's one of the things driving this problem. We know that the 85% or greater than 85% load that comes from the Maumee River and comes from agricultural runoff, that's what's driving harmful algal blooms in Lake Erie. And we've also worked hard to show the agricultural community that it is them, that it's not the Detroit River, because the concentration of phosphorus in the Detroit River is 30 times less than the concentration of phosphorus in the Maumee River. In fact, the concentration of phosphorus coming in from the Detroit River is not large enough to produce a harmful algal bloom. We also know that it's not lawn care because in 2013, Scott's Miracle-Gro removed phosphorus from the lawn care products and 95% of the market followed suit. Failing septic tanks is only 4% of the load. CSOs, or combined sewer overflows, are about 1% of the load. So we've isolated it now. This problem is an agricultural problem. What I've done here is show we started monitoring the harmful algal blooms using satellites in 2002. And so you see the size of the blooms on the western basin and central basin of Lake Erie from 2002 to 2020. The red areas are very dense concentrations of algae. The black areas represent no harmful algal blooms. We're now, I should tell you, we're now seeing harmful algal blooms every year in the central basin in addition to the western basin. And we know that it's the spring load of phosphorus out of the Maumee River that determines the size of the bloom. So how much do we need to reduce this load to deal with the problem? In the 1960s and 70s, we needed to reduce the load by 60%. I chaired the team of scientists from the Ohio Phosphorus Task Force in 2013, and we recommended a 40% reduction. The U.S. and Canada, through the International Joint Commission, agreed with that assessment. In 2013, we also put together a team of 25 scientists from the U.S. and Canada. I chaired that group, focused on harmful algal blooms in the western and central basin and the dead zone in the central basin. And again, we found that we needed to reduce the spring load of phosphorus from the Maumee River by 40% to deal with harmful algal blooms, and we needed to reduce the annual load of phosphorus to the central basin by 40% to deal with the dead zone in the central basin. We recommended monitoring our progress, not by assessing how many farmers are doing what on the land, but by actually measuring the concentration of phosphorus in the tributaries. Looking at that concentration of concentration of phosphorus, that's how you determine whether we're being successful or not. The U.S. and Canada agreed with our recommendations and signed that agreement in February of 2016. So over 5 years ago, we've had complete agreement, and we've been working on this issue now for about 15 years myself, and as a group of scientists for about 12 years, 13 years now. And I want to give you an assessment of where we are. Well, first, we know right now we're in the middle of the third battle of Lake Erie. The first battle we won with tall ships. Oliver Hazard Perry defeated the British, uttered the famous quotation, "We have met the enemy and they are ours." The second battle we won, and we did that dealing with sewage treatment plants. Improved sewage treatment by between 75 and 90%. The lake responded, became the walleye capital of the world. We're in the middle of the third battle now, and we need to address this battle by improving farm management practices. So what are we recommending for the farmers to do? 4 recommendations. The first 2 shown here in red are by far the most important. We will not succeed unless we do these first 2 recommendations, the first being the most important. And if every farmer did just those 2 actions, this problem would go away. So the first recommendation is pretty simple. We don't want to harm agricultural production, so the first recommendation is don't apply more fertilizer than is needed for maximum crop production. The second one is when you apply it, insert it into the soil 3 to 5 inches as you would with the seeds, rather than simply broadcasting it and laying at the surface. The other 2 recommendations, controlling erosion and improving soil health, put more carbon into the soil so that it holds more water and reduces runoff. Excellent things to be doing, but the first 2 are by far the most important. There's only 3 ways to get farmers to take those actions. We've spent a lot of time on the voluntary approach. Use outreach and education and encourage voluntary action. What we've found is that the concentration of phosphorus going into the lake has not changed. So we've been working on this for 12 years. The 2 countries have been signed and in agreement on this for the last 5 years, and we've seen 0 improvement in that flow-weighted mean concentration. We can use incentives and disincentives to encourage voluntary adoption. And we're doing a lot of work right now with incentives, but every good incentive program has an equally effective disincentive program, carrots and sticks. Right now we only have carrots. Or we could go with regulations. We've had a few regulations implemented, but so far we haven't had meaningful regulations. So let's take a look at manure and commercial fertilizer, because I believe that manure is playing a very important role in this problem. First thing you have to understand is that when we measure the amount of phosphorus in a field, the amount of phosphorus in the soil, we do a soil test, measure that amount. The concentration of phosphorus in the runoff from that field is directly related to the concentration of phosphorus in the soil. You have more phosphorus in the soil, the concentration of phosphorus running off goes up. We also know that there's nothing inherently wrong with manure. When manure and commercial fertilizer are applied at the same rates, they have the same impact. The problem is that our guidelines right now allow manure to be applied at 4 times the amount needed for maximum crop production. So we're really doing waste disposal, not fertilization. When we look at the worst fields around Ohio and in the Maumee, for instance, we find fields that have phosphorus concentrations that are 20 to 40 times the amount needed for maximum crop production. Those fields are bleeding huge amount of phosphorus in the runoff from those fields. We're also seeing a great increase in the number of animal operations and the number of animals in the area. And people need to understand the size of these operations. In order to be considered a regulated, confined animal feeding operation, or a CAFO, if you're a dairy operation, you have to have more than 700 cows. If you have less than 700 cows, you're not considered a regulated operation, and you can basically do whatever you want. You have to have more than 2,500 hogs, and you have to have more than 1.25 million chickens. Guidelines given to the CAFOs allow them to apply 4 times more than 4 times needed for maximum crop production. So one of the things that we could consider, and also we should look at the unregulated CAFOs, those just below 700 cows or just below 2,500 hogs. That's where the greatest growth has occurred since 2005, with over a 40% increase in those, and we've seen the number of animals in the Maumee go from 9 million animals to 20 million animals. So policy considerations, what could we potentially do? Well, the future is going to be based on our ability to sustainably control agricultural pollution. And we should begin with sustainable agriculture has to begin with not applying too much phosphorus and too much nitrogen, and we know the voluntary approach has not worked. We also know there's an opportunity here, I think, for gain understanding that about more than half of the farmed land is rented. It's not farmed by the person that owns it. You're not likely to take a lot of voluntary actions on land that you don't own. We know that our solutions have to be independent of the price of corn, and we know that about 40% of the corn goes to ethanol production and 40% goes to animal feed. We could also choose to focus only on larger farms and eliminate the smaller farmers from any kind of a regulatory environment. And we know that 55% of the farms are 50 acres or less, but they represent only 3% of the land, meaning that 45% of the farms are greater than 50 acres, and those farms represent 97% of the acres. We've got to reduce the rate that we allow manure to be applied. We have to incorporate disincentives with our incentives. We have to recognize that only 14% of the animal operations are regulated, so the other ones are probably applying more than 4 times the amount. We need to help farmers transport manure greater distances and help them insert fertilizer into the soil. I'm very optimistic about Governor DeWine's H2 Ohio program, and the portion that I like the best is what DNR is doing with creation of wetlands. That's a real long-term fix, but we have to recognize that if we added 40,000 acres of wetland in the Maumee watershed and strategically placed those wetlands, we need to get a 40% reduction, and those 40,000 acres would get us about 10% of the way. Last thing I would say is that there's a hearing next month in Toledo looking at a total maximum daily load level, where Environmental Law and Policy Center has sued US EPA requiring that. I'm hopeful that that requirement goes forward. A TMDL requires that we set a target, and I think we already have that target from the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, but it also requires them to specify the actions that will be taken to address that target, and those actions have to be likely of producing success. I think that that's what we need to have happen right now. With that, I will stop. I appreciate the opportunity to come and speak to you. And I'll leave up here for a second here. There's some additional reading if people are interested in that. And with that, I'll take a few questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Reutter, for your presentation and for all that you've done for the Lake Erie area. We have a number of questions, and we thank Dr. Reutter for graciously allowing us to ask you these questions. And we certainly have a number of questions from a lot of enthusiasts. So I'll start with one of them. A recent study in Nature Communications reports that even the deepest part of the Great Lakes have been warmed by climate change. What is the impact of this development in the region's economy?
Well, it's incredibly important. And let me give you I mentioned in one of my slides that when we look at the various components of the load of phosphorus to the western basin of Lake Erie, and we know that most of it's coming in out of the Maumee River and the Sandusky River, and we see that loading from the bottom of the western basin of Lake Erie, the sediments that are in the bottom, that produces 3 to 7% of the load each year, so it's relatively small. The temperature in the western basin, in the western basin of Lake Erie, in the summer reaches 81 degrees. That's about as high as it gets. That would be in the Put-in-Bay area. If the temperature of the western basin increased to 83 degrees, the amount of phosphorus in the bottom sediments, the amount released would increase and equal the amount from the Maumee River. So the impact of this warming of the bottom sediments, and in the article you were referring to, they were looking at the much, much deeper points than the western basin of Lake Erie, average depth only 24 feet. They were looking at the 1,333-foot depths in Lake Superior, but you can see that the increased warming of the Great Lakes will result in a faster rate of oxygen depletion in the central basin. The dead zone will get bigger and last longer, and then the western basin will have a lot more phosphorus released and harmful algal blooms will get worse. Both of those things will have a huge impact on human health and the economy.
Okay, thank you. You have some fishing enthusiasts that are very concerned about the silver carp. How would silver carp get into the lake, and what has happened to keep them out? And then there's a follow-up to that. What has caused the rate of invasion species invasion species growth to go down?
Well, a number of things. First, the most likely location for the fish to enter would be through the canals in or the Chicago River in Chicago. And essentially, back in the early 1900s, at Chicago, they diverted the flow of the Chicago River, so instead of flowing into Lake Michigan, it flows out of Lake Michigan and carries Chicago sewage out into the Mississippi River. Improve the quality of Lake Michigan and dealt with cholera problems that they were having at the time. But we now have silver carp literally almost into Lake Michigan, and they're kept out by an electrical barrier that's been put in by the Corps of Engineers, and it's working quite effectively. But if there's any problems with that electrical barrier, or if we have a situation where barge traffic would force silver carp through the channel, we could still get silver carp in that way. So that is probably right now the most likely scenario on how they would get in. There's a number of reasons why the number of introductions have gone down. We've created separations in watersheds from the Wabash River and the Maumee River, and we have greatly improved the way we deal with ballast water from freighters coming in and out of the Great Lakes. So I think that's probably the best answer to that question.
Is the Clean Water Act of 1972 and any other companion legislations still comprehensive enough to meet current environmental needs for water quality?
Simple answer to that is no. When we look at and the key reason I would say no on that is that the Clean Water Act focuses on point sources, and it does a good job at dealing with point sources, so meaning that I see the pollution coming out of a pipe going straight into a river, stream, lake, whatever it may be. The Clean Water Act does not deal with non-point pollution, meaning the agricultural runoff, and the problems that we have right now are driven primarily by agricultural runoff. So we need some kind of an expansion of the Clean Water Act to give us more strength there.
Okay. Iowa has used farm field edge prairie vegetation to reduce some of the phosphorus runoffs by over 80% into the Mississippi River turbines. How is Ohio using these biological technologies?
That's a very good point. And essentially, when you think of buffer strips along creeks and at the edge of fields, the idea is to capture the nutrients as it leaves the field and have the vegetation that's in that buffer capture it. And as you would expect, the kind of vegetation, some vegetation captures more phosphorus than others. We have challenges with buffer strips, and I hate to see too much emphasis placed on buffer strips. I'd prefer to see the emphasis placed on the amount being applied. And so if you have a field that already has more phosphorus than it needs, we should not be applying more phosphorus to that field. Back to the buffer strip question, the other key point on buffer strips and on the vegetation that's in those buffer strips gets back to one of the points that I made, that we need to have solutions that are independent of commodity prices. What we often see, if the price of corn is $2 a bushel, farmers would put in buffer strips. But if the price of corn is $7 a bushel, they're going to go ahead and plant right up to the edge to take advantage of that buffer strip. So buffer strips, a very good thing, but we have to deal with the commodity price issue, and we have to deal with a voluntary impact of those.
How do you feel about wind turbines being installed in the lake?
From a water quality standpoint, I don't expect any significant impact of wind turbines. What this really comes down to is that some people look at wind turbines, whether they're in the lake or they're on land, and they get a warm, fuzzy feeling when they see that wind turbine, and other people look at those and they absolutely hate them. I simply, in Lake Erie, I don't see it as impacting our water quality. I see it more as impacting our resource from a navigation standpoint. Very challenging with the amount of shipping that we have, the amount of boating. It's not unusual to see 10,000 boats out on the western basin of Lake Erie on a good weekend in the summer. So most of these turbines are being considered for the central basin, less boat traffic, further offshore. That makes sense. There's still issues with that, and I would much prefer to see those wind turbines placed on farmland in northwest Ohio, where the farmer would get some benefit from that turbine being present.
And last question, what are your thoughts about the current version of the Great Lakes Compact? What is the best thing it accomplishes, and what can it do better?
The Great Lakes Compact is a really incredibly interesting issue right at this time. Yeah, the Great Lake Compact prevents us from taking water out of the lakes and transferring it to some other location around the country. So we've always been concerned about Arizona or somewhere in California taking our water from the Great Lakes. When water levels are very low, that is incredibly important. When water levels are really high, that issue becomes less important. But there's always the concern that if we allow them to take water when the water levels are high, you can't stop them from taking it when the water levels are low, and that would be incredibly harmful. It's a very challenging issue because, quite frankly, there are a number of times during high water flow, during one of those 10 storm events on the Maumee River, that I would love to send some of that water to California.
Thank you.
All right.
Dr. Reutter, thank you so much for being with us today. Your presentation was very informative and very interesting. On behalf of the Akron Roundtable, we'd like to present to you with this contemplative sun. This work of art was designed exclusively for the Akron Roundtable and by local artist Don Drum. Again, thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. Please remember to join us again next month for our virtual forum on May 20th. Thanks again and have a wonderful day.